Bill Goldberg kicked me in the head and ended my career, it was such a lousy way to go because I didn't know my career was over. And when I did go home, and it took me a year to find out that my career was over.
WWE legends explain how scary Goldberg was, because when Goldberg's music hit, fans saw a monster they could cheer for, but wrestlers saw a monster they had to survive. In June 2019, in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia, two of wrestling's biggest icons stepped into the ring together for the first time in years. Bill Goldberg and The Undertaker. Fans in the stadium roared loudly with excitement, many of them traveling long distances just to see this exact match happen live. This was supposed to be a dream match. Two legends, two auras, one huge night. But within minutes, that dream turned into something else entirely. Goldberg went for his signature spear. He missed. He crashed full speed into the steel ring post. He looked badly hurt. He looked confused. The crowd did not know it yet, but the man they were watching was concussed and still trying to finish the match. Later in that same match, Goldberg attempted his finishing move, the jackhammer. He could not hold The Undertaker properly. He dropped him hard, directly onto his head and neck. It was not a planned spot gone slightly wrong. It looked like real danger, because it was real danger. And if moments like this make you want the real stories behind wrestling's biggest icons, use the hype feature and give this video some hype, because this story only gets more uncomfortable from here. That night in Saudi Arabia was not a one-off accident. Wrestlers who worked with Goldberg for years had been saying the same thing long before that match. Goldberg was scary, not because of a character, not because of a gimmick. He was scary because of what could happen when his power slipped out of control. The Undertaker was one of the most respected performers of his generation. He had survived decades in the ring. He was big, tough, and vastly experienced. If Goldberg could put even him in danger, then the warnings from other legends over the years suddenly made a lot more sense. This was not just a scary character on television. To many of the people who stepped into the ring with him, Goldberg was a real risk to their bodies and their careers. Across arenas, across decades, and across every roster he ever worked on, this is the story of why so many wrestling legends feared Goldberg. Not because he wanted to hurt them, but because when things went wrong, he did not always know how to stop the damage. It is a story that stretches across more than 2 decades, through 2 different companies, and through the bodies of some of the most respected performers the business has ever produced. When Goldberg's music hit in an arena, the fans lost their minds. He looked like nothing else in wrestling at the time. He was a former NFL defensive tackle. He weighed around 285 pounds, and he moved with a speed and power that did not match his size. Fans saw a monster who flattened opponents in seconds. Squash match after squash match. He looked unbeatable. His entrance alone could make a building shake. This period of his career became legendary in its own right. He built a winning streak that stretched across 173 matches without a single loss. Nobody in modern wrestling had ever been presented quite like that before. Every week, fans tuned in expecting to see him destroy another opponent in under 2 minutes. And week after week, that is exactly what they got. It made him one of the hottest attractions in the entire industry, seemingly overnight. But behind the curtain, in the locker room, plenty of veterans saw something completely different. They did not see an unstoppable monster. They saw a wrestler who had barely any training, and who hit far too hard, far too often. In wrestling, there is a term for this. It is called working stiff. It simply means that strikes, kicks, spears, and slams land with far more force than they should. A move can look devastating on camera, while the wrestler underneath is actually protected. Goldberg's moves often look devastating because they really were. The difference between a safe wrestler and a dangerous one is not about who looks tougher. A safe wrestler can make a move look brutal while keeping their opponent's body protected. That is the entire skill of the business. 2 people trust each other completely, and they work together to make violence look real without anyone getting seriously hurt. A dangerous wrestler breaks that formula. The violence looks real because too much of it actually is real. Most fans watching at home never think about any of this. They see a slam, and they see a wrestler crash down. They do not see the small, practiced details underneath it. Where the hands are placed, how much of the fall is broken by the wrestler taking the move, how much speed is taken off a strike just before it lands. These details are invisible to a television camera, but they are the entire difference between a long, healthy career and a short, injury-filled one. Goldberg had never been given the years of quiet practice needed to learn those details properly. That gap between the character fans saw and the reality other wrestlers faced became the whole story of Goldberg's career. He was a massive star. He drew huge crowds and made a lot of money for the companies he worked for. Nobody denies that part. But behind that success sat a serious problem that veterans quietly worried about for years. Working with Goldberg could mean walking away with a real injury, not just a sore body from a normal night's work. Understanding why this kept happening means going back to the very start of Goldberg's career and looking closely at how quickly he moved from complete beginner to one of the biggest stars in the entire industry. It helps to look at how fast Goldberg reached the top of the wrestling business. Most wrestlers spend years learning their craft in small venues, away from cameras, making mistakes where nobody important is watching. Goldberg did not get that path. He trained at the WCW power plant, a place known for building raw strength and power moves, rather than teaching the safer, technical side of the business. Within less than a year of starting there, he was fast-tracked to the main event of World Championship Wrestling. He had the look, he had raw power, he had the crowd behind him from almost his very first match. What he did not have was time. He never learned the quiet, hidden part of the business that most wrestlers spend years mastering. That hidden part is called protecting your opponent. In wrestling, every move relies on trust. A slam is never just a slam. A kick is never just a kick. Both wrestlers are relying on each other to control speed, distance, timing, and force, so that the move looks devastating without actually being devastating. If one wrestler is careless with any of those things, the other person can be seriously hurt. It does not take a moment of anger to cause damage. It can happen through a simple lack of control on a single ordinary night. Most performers spend their early years learning this trust, in low-pressure settings, where mistakes can be corrected quietly, and nobody outside the room ever finds out. They learn how to fall properly. They learn how to absorb a strike so it looks painful without actually hurting. They learn how to communicate silently with a partner in the middle of a match, adjusting on the fly if something feels wrong. This is the invisible curriculum of professional wrestling, and it usually takes years to properly absorb. Goldberg was pushed past almost all of it. That lack of training became painfully clear early in Goldberg's career, long before most fans were paying close attention to how his matches were actually built. Almost all of his early matches followed the same short pattern. A squash match, lasting around 60 to 90 seconds, where Goldberg simply overpowered someone and finished them off quickly. It worked brilliantly on television. It made him look unstoppable night after night. But it also meant Goldberg was never truly tested. He never had to manage a long, back-and-forth match where two wrestlers share control and build a story together over several minutes. A short squash match asks very little of a performer in terms of technical skill. There is no need for complicated exchanges, no need for careful pacing, and very little room for anything to go wrong before the match is already over. A longer match asks for something completely different. It asks two performers to guide each other through several minutes of carefully controlled violence, adjusting constantly based on subtle cues that only experienced wrestlers know how to read. Goldberg had almost no practice reading those cues, because his early career had never required it of him. That changed on the 9th of February 1998, during a live broadcast of WCW Monday Nitro in El Paso, Texas. Goldberg, undefeated at the time, was booked in a longer match against the highly experienced British wrestler, William Regal. The plan was simple on paper. Give fans a 6-minute match that proved Goldberg could do more than just squash people in under 2 minutes. It did not go to plan. Regal tried to lead Goldberg through basic technical exchanges, the kind of holds and escapes that experienced wrestlers use to build a match together. Goldberg froze. He did not understand the cues Regal was giving him. He could not follow the switches and reversals that make this kind of wrestling work. To stop the live broadcast from falling apart in front of a national audience, Regal had no choice but to keep attacking, applying real pressure just to keep the match moving forward. At one point, following a rope break, Regal threw a stiff kick to Goldberg's face. Goldberg was left visibly shaken, rubbing his eyebrows and unsure of where he even was in the ring. Goldberg later believed Regal had done this out of personal anger. Regal always maintained that he was simply doing what he had to do to carry an inexperienced performer through a difficult live segment. Either way, the match badly damaged the idea that Goldberg was some kind of unbeatable machine, and it showed, very early on, exactly how little training he actually had underneath all that power. This early warning sign did not stop Goldberg's push to the top. If anything, the company doubled down on his aura of invincibility, but the gap between his character and his actual skill level did not go away. It simply moved to the background, waiting to resurface in far more serious ways. Looking back, The El Paso match against Regal should have been treated as a serious warning sign. It showed, in front of a national television audience, that Goldberg could not yet safely handle anything outside of his tightly controlled squash match formula. Instead, the company treated it as a minor bump in the road, and the push towards the top continued at the same breakneck speed as before. The lesson from that night was not learned in time to prevent what came later. It is worth pausing here to notice how differently this single match could have gone. If Goldberg had been given more time to develop before being placed in a genuinely competitive match on live television, some of what followed in later years might never have happened at all. Instead, the pattern was set early. Push first, worry about the gaps in his training later. That order of priorities would keep repeating itself throughout the rest of his career. One of those moments came just months later, in June 1998, during an episode of WCW Monday Nitro, in what was supposed to be nothing more than a routine television segment. Goldberg executed one of his signature spears on a performer known as La Parka, a move he had already performed successfully many times before without any real issue. The impact was so heavy that La Parka collapsed, clutching his knee. Some believe La Parka used the moment, and Goldberg's growing reputation for being dangerous, as a convenient excuse to write himself off television and compete elsewhere. The story itself says something important about the reputation Goldberg had already built by that point. Even a routine spear from Goldberg carried enough force that other performers began treating him as a risk worth avoiding if they could help it, long before the more serious incidents that would follow in later years. A similar pattern showed up later that same year, in October 1998, during a highly rehearsed 10-minute title match against Diamond Dallas Page. This was meant to be one of Goldberg's most technically demanding matches yet, carefully planned out in advance, with both men putting real effort into building something more layered than a typical squash match. Partway through, Goldberg suffered a concussion. Working on instinct rather than the planned sequence, he kicked out of Diamond Dallas Page's finishing move, the Diamond Cutter, at a moment that was never scripted. It broke the pacing of the entire match. Page was left visibly frustrated, having built a careful match plan that fell apart because Goldberg's own body and mind were no longer fully in control. Both of these early incidents share the same underlying cause: a concussion, absorbed quietly and without proper attention, that then affected everything happening around it. Long before concussion protocols became a serious part of the wrestling business, these moments were treated as unfortunate blips, rather than warning signs, of a much bigger problem waiting to resurface. These earlier incidents set the stage for what would become the most devastating example in Goldberg's entire career, the one story that, more than any other, came to define how the wrestling business truly saw him behind closed doors. No story shows the true danger of working with him more clearly than what happened to Bret Hart. Everything that had been quietly whispered about backstage, the stiff strikes, the lack of technical control, the sense that Goldberg's power was never fully guided by his own judgment, came together in one single, unforgettable moment on live television. Bret Hart was widely seen as one of the safest and most technically gifted wrestlers of his generation. He was known for protecting the people he worked with, night after night, for years. When he stepped into the ring with Goldberg at Starrcade in December 1999, Bret Hart was defending the WCW World Heavyweight Championship. Before the match even began, Bret told Goldberg directly, "Do not hurt me." Early in the match, Goldberg whipped Bret into the ropes. As Bret came back, Goldberg threw a full-force kick. It was meant to be controlled. It was not. Goldberg's boot struck Bret directly behind the ear with brutal, uninhibited force. The blow instantly concussed Hart, causing immediate confusion and leaving him holding his neck in a daze, visibly unable to recall even the basic outline of the pre-planned finish that the two men had agreed on earlier that same day. Because there were no real head trauma rules in place at the time, Bret was allowed to keep working. He wrestled several more televised matches over the following weeks while quietly managing severe symptoms on his own, describing that period as a constant pounding daze that he tried to push through match after match. When he finally saw a specialist, the diagnosis was serious. He was told in no uncertain terms that his career was very likely over. The damage from that single kick changed the rest of Bret Hart's life. He was diagnosed with post-concussion syndrome. Bret had to give up the WCW World Heavyweight Championship the following month, and he never fully returned to full-time wrestling again. A career built over decades, filled with classic matches and huge moments, ended because of one badly placed kick that landed with far more force than it should have. Bret has spoken about how heavily that period weighed on him, both physically and mentally. He was used to being one of the safest hands in the entire business, a wrestler other performers specifically asked to work with because they knew he would protect them. To have his own career taken away by exactly the kind of carelessness he had spent his whole life avoiding felt especially cruel. the long-term effects of that head trauma did not simply disappear once he stepped away from wrestling. Years later, Bret suffered a serious stroke after a cycling accident, and many close to him have pointed to his history of head injuries as a factor in how fragile his health had already become by that point. For Bret Hart, this was never just about physical pain. It was about trust. Bret has spoken many times about how wrestling depends on an unspoken agreement between two performers. When you step into the ring with someone, you are putting your body and your future in their hands. To Bret, Goldberg broke that agreement. Not because he meant to hurt him. This was never seen as a deliberate act of malice. But intent did not undo the damage. Bret still lost his career. Bret still lived with the physical consequences for years afterwards. For him, the fact that it was not intentional did not make it hurt any less. This single moment reshaped how many people in the wrestling business viewed Goldberg. Before Starrcade 1999, his intensity could be seen as part of his aura. He was supposed to look dangerous. He was supposed to look like a wrecking machine that nobody could control. Fans wanted exactly that. It made him must-see television every single week. But Bret Hart's career ending showed the other side of that same aura. When the force behind Goldberg's power became fully real, the cost was not just a rough night in the ring. It could be a life-changing injury that followed someone for the rest of their days. Goldberg's power sold tickets and made him one of the biggest stars of his era. That same power also made the people who worked with him wonder if they were truly safe standing across the ring from him. This is what makes the Starrcade story so important to the wider picture. It was not simply one bad match. It became proof of a pattern that other wrestlers had already noticed, and that others would go on to experience for themselves in the years that followed. Bret has since spoken openly and critically about Goldberg in public, describing him as dangerous and expressing real frustration that Goldberg went on to earn large amounts of money for short matches years later, while Bret himself had been forced into early retirement by a single unguided kick. One of the clearest examples of that pattern involved Scott Steiner, a former standout amateur wrestler with a legitimate athletic background and a reputation for real toughness. Steiner was not the kind of performer who simply absorbed careless offense without responding. He had come up through legitimate amateur competition, and he carried that same physical mindset into his professional matches. Matches between Goldberg and Steiner were frequently stiff, with Steiner sometimes giving Goldberg real physical receipts whenever a spot went wrong. Before one of their major encounters, Goldberg accidentally fractured Steiner's orbital bone, forcing Steiner to wrestle in a protective mask for a period afterwards. Their tension boiled over during a no disqualification match, when Goldberg attempted a move from the electric chair position and executed it carelessly, dropping Steiner early and hard into the ropes without any warning. Steiner responded immediately with a series of real, full-force elbows and forearms to Goldberg's head, forcing a stunned Goldberg to push him away once he understood the blows were not part of the plan. Later in that same match, Goldberg spiked himself badly enough during a move that he was left too concussed and disoriented to kick out of a pinfall on his own. To stop an unplanned title change happening live on television, the referee was forced to quietly reach down and lift Goldberg's shoulder off the mat himself, while counting, hiding the mistake from the crowd watching at home. Looking back on it now, that single match captured almost everything wrestlers feared about working with Goldberg. Carelessness that put a genuine athlete in danger, a retaliation born out of necessity rather than choice, and, once again, a Goldberg who was too disoriented to even protect himself, let alone anyone standing across the ring from him. It also showed something else important. Steiner was one of the few performers with the legitimate physical toughness to answer stiff work with stiff work of his own. Most wrestlers did not have that option. Most simply had to absorb whatever happened and hope the damage was not permanent. Which brings the story back to that night in Saudi Arabia in 2019. The match against The Undertaker was not an isolated moment. It was the clearest modern example of exactly what legends like Bret Hart and Scott Steiner had already experienced for themselves years earlier. The Undertaker was not a small or inexperienced performer who could be easily overwhelmed. He was one of the most respected leaders in any wrestling locker room in history. He was large, powerful, and had decades of experience handling dangerous situations safely. If anyone should have been able to manage a match with Goldberg without serious risk, it was him. Yet even The Undertaker found himself in a genuinely frightening position that night, in front of a huge international audience watching what was supposed to be a celebration of two careers, rather than a genuinely dangerous situation unfolding in real time. The trouble began before the match had even started. Goldberg's own pre-match ritual left him bleeding and shaken before he had even reached the ring. Once the bell rang, he misjudged the distance to the ring post while going for his spear, thanks to the unfamiliar turnbuckle layout of the Saudi arena, and crashed into it at full speed. From that point onwards, Goldberg was operating in a state of severe confusion. The referee checked in with him over and over throughout the match, and every single time, Goldberg gave a different, disjointed answer, yet the match was never stopped. Once Goldberg was hurt, confused, and working on instinct after that collision, control of the match slipped away almost completely. The botched jackhammer that followed was the clearest sign of how bad things had become. Goldberg simply could not manage the lift safely, and The Undertaker paid the price for it, landing awkwardly on his head and neck in front of a huge live audience. Moments later, when The Undertaker delivered his own finishing move, the Tombstone Piledriver, Goldberg failed to properly tuck his head or support his own weight, and the crown of his skull drove directly into the canvas. What this moment proved was simple and unsettling. It did not matter how experienced or careful the other wrestler was. When Goldberg's explosive style broke down, even the most seasoned performer in the business could be placed in real danger. The look on The Undertaker's face at the end of that match said everything that words could not. It was not the look of a performer who had just finished a fun, well-executed contest. It was a look of genuine anger and shock, the kind that comes from realizing exactly how close something had come to going terribly wrong. Backstage afterwards, the two men were reportedly heard shouting at each other over exactly what had gone wrong out there. That expression became one of the lasting images from the entire match. It captured, in a single moment, the fear that other legends had quietly been describing for over 20 years. The Undertaker later admitted, when reflecting on the match publicly, that the extreme heat and humidity in Saudi Arabia had made the whole night an absolute nightmare for two aging performers trying to work through it together. Even with that honest admission about the conditions, the underlying danger of the match itself was never in doubt. What happened out there was not simply the result of tired bodies in a hot stadium. It was the direct result of Goldberg losing control after a head injury, and nobody around that ring stepping in soon enough to stop it. Goldberg's danger was not only something that showed up in the ring during matches, it also followed him backstage, shaping how other wrestlers dealt with him away from the cameras. Chris Jericho's history with Goldberg is one of the clearest examples of this. Back in World Championship Wrestling, Jericho had wanted to build a major program with Goldberg. At the time, this could have meant big matches and a lot of money for both men. Goldberg refused. He was fiercely protective of his image as an unstoppable, silent monster, and he did not want anything in the storyline that might soften or complicate that carefully built presentation in front of the fans. This refusal created real tension between the two of them, tension that did not simply disappear over time. Years later, once both men were working in WWE, that old tension boiled over into something physical. Goldberg had reportedly been talking about Jericho behind his back, criticizing the way he worked. When word of this reached Jericho, he confronted Goldberg directly, backstage, without waiting for anyone else to get involved. Despite the obvious size difference between them, Jericho was not intimidated. Goldberg reached out and grabbed him by the throat. Jericho immediately swatted the hand away and pushed Goldberg in the chest. When Goldberg charged at him with his head down, Jericho sidestepped and caught him in a front facelock, a legitimate hold he had learned from his time working as a bouncer. He held Goldberg down on the floor, keeping the pressure on until the rest of the locker room stepped in to separate them. Even as agents pulled the two apart, Goldberg managed to break free for a moment and pull at Jericho's hair before order was finally restored. The scuffle spilled out of the dressing room and into a public hallway, in full view of shocked fans nearby, before agents and other wrestlers managed to pull the two men apart and get them back inside. This was a genuine physical confrontation, not a performance for the cameras. It showed something important about Goldberg's presence within the wrestling business. His reputation for being intimidating was not limited to what fans saw during matches. It extended into the locker room itself, where pride, pressure, and a sense of real-world intimidation created a genuinely volatile atmosphere. Jericho was not trying to become the hero of this particular story. What his confrontation revealed was simply how tense things could become around Goldberg, even away from the ring, and how that tension could spill out into something physical without much warning at all. Younger, less established performers did not always have the standing to push back the way a veteran like Jericho could. Wrestlers were not only afraid of what Goldberg might accidentally do to them, many were also unsettled by what he was willing to do to himself before a match had even begun. Part of Goldberg's pre-match routine involved deliberately headbutting solid steel locker room doors over and over in order to psych himself up before walking out to the ring. This was not a small gesture for show. He would sometimes stagger out towards the entrance already bleeding from his forehead, and quite possibly already concussed, before the bell had even rung to start the match. In other words, some of the danger Goldberg brought into his matches did not begin with an opponent at all. It began with the way he prepared himself, alone, before anyone else was even involved. This exact habit is what led directly to the disastrous state he was already in before facing The Undertaker in Saudi Arabia. Another moment from earlier in his career reinforced this same pattern of self-inflicted risk. During a segment in World Championship Wrestling, Goldberg was supposed to smash the window of a limousine using a pipe as part of a storyline. Instead, he chose to use his bare hands. The glass badly cut his arm, severing an artery. He lost a huge amount of blood in the process, and very nearly lost the use of his arm entirely. The injury was serious enough to keep him out of action for around 5 months. These examples reveal something important about the wider picture. Goldberg's biggest danger was not always about anger, and it was not always about a lack of respect for other people's safety. Sometimes it was simply a lack of restraint, aimed at his own body just as much as anyone else's. If he was willing to hurt himself this badly in pursuit of intensity, it becomes easier to understand why other wrestlers were nervous about what might happen to them once real chaos entered the equation during an actual match. Goldberg himself has spoken about this mindset in the past, describing his approach as trying to make everything feel as violent and as real as possible, and treating the bruises, the blood, and the concussions that followed as an acceptable price to pay for that realism. That mindset might explain why he was willing to put his own body on the line so often. It does not fully explain why other performers, who never agreed to that same trade-off for themselves, kept ending up injured alongside him. All of this leads to the central question that defines Goldberg's legacy inside the wrestling business. Professional wrestling has always needed performers who look genuinely scary. The entire industry is built around larger-than-life figures who make audiences believe that something huge is about to happen. Goldberg had that quality in enormous supply. He looked like a final boss walking towards the ring. He moved like a car crash waiting to happen. Fans believed every second of it, and that belief made him one of the biggest draws of his era. But there is a real difference between looking scary and actually being unsafe. A great wrestler can make danger feel completely real for the audience while still keeping their opponent protected underneath it all. The person on the receiving end of a move should end up hurt within the story being told, not hurt in real life once the cameras stop rolling. That distinction is the whole foundation the modern wrestling business is built on. Countless wrestlers throughout history have built entire careers around looking terrifying without ever becoming a genuine safety concern to the people they worked with. That is the standard the business quietly expects from anyone given a run at the top. Goldberg reached the top faster than almost anyone in wrestling history, but the part of that standard built around protecting the people around him never fully caught up with the rest of his push. Time and time again throughout his career, Goldberg blurred that line, and each new example added weight to the argument that this was never simply bad luck. The match against William Regal exposed just how little technical training he actually had beneath the power. Bret Hart's story showed the devastating cost of a single badly placed kick, one that ended a legendary career almost overnight. The Scott Steiner feud showed how quickly a stiff mistake could turn into real, physical retaliation between two athletes. The match against The Undertaker showed exactly what could happen when Goldberg was already hurt and still trying to push through and finish a match regardless. Chris Jericho's backstage confrontation, whether the cameras were rolling or not, and the head-butted doors in the limousine incident showed that his intensity could just as easily turn inward, becoming self-destructive rather than only dangerous to others. None of these moments happened in isolation. Together they built a pattern that veterans within the wrestling business could not ignore, no matter how much money Goldberg brought in, or how loudly the crowd cheered every time his music hit. Each new incident reinforced what the last one had already shown. This was not simply bad luck following one performer around. It was the direct result of raw power being handed enormous responsibility, without ever being given the proper training to carry it safely. By the time all of these stories are placed side by side, a clear picture starts to form. Goldberg was, without question, a phenomenal box office draw. Very few performers in wrestling history could match the raw excitement he generated the moment he stepped through the curtain, and that excitement is exactly why this story matters so much, because it forces fans to hold two very different truths about the same man at the same time. But for some of the wrestlers who actually had to face him, sharing the ring with Goldberg was not simply about having a good match. For them, it felt closer to an exercise in pure survival. Think about how unusual that really is. In almost any other job, if a colleague repeatedly injured the people around him, there would be serious consequences long before a pattern like this could stretch across 2 decades and 2 different companies. In wrestling, the business often protected its biggest attraction instead. The money he brought in, the crowds he drew, and the aura he carried all worked together to shield him from the kind of scrutiny that might have slowed him down and forced real changes to how he worked. That protection came at a cost, and the people who paid that cost were rarely the ones cashing the biggest checks. Goldberg was never scary simply because he looked like he could destroy the person standing across from him. Plenty of wrestlers have looked that way without ever becoming a genuine concern backstage. He was scary because, for some of the biggest legends this business has ever produced, stepping into the ring with him meant trusting a man who did not always seem to know exactly how much damage he was capable of causing. For decades, that fear stayed mostly hidden from the average fan, tucked away in locker room conversations, interviews years after the fact, and quiet warnings passed between performers who had learned the hard way. The Undertaker match in Saudi Arabia changed that. It put the danger on full display, in high definition, in front of the entire wrestling world, at a point in both men's careers when nobody expected anything like it to happen again. That is the story wrestling insiders have quietly been telling for decades, and it is the story that finally became impossible to ignore once the whole world watched it play out again in Saudi Arabia in 2019.